Hello and welcome to this session on player guidance in level design. Before we dive into it, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Lars Kalthoff and I'm a game design student at the Cologne Game Lab. Right now I'm in my 5th semester and I'm now working on a self-initiated project which is all about developing and teaching a game design course at my university. When I'm not teaching but actually working on games, I usually focus on the areas of narrative design, but also managing projects and producing, and more relevant to this session, level design. And my approach to level design really changed when I learned about player guidance and the associated methods and techniques, and that is why I want to talk to you about it today. About this session, we'll start with a quick introduction on what player guidance is, why you should even bother, and how you can apply it to your own levels. Then we'll quickly go over specific guiding techniques that are used in popular games all the time, and also take a look at their advantages and disadvantages. In the third step, I will present to you a practical assignment that you can work on in case you want to improve your player guidance skills. And we'll wrap up the session with a bit more theory on how you could categorize different means of player guidance and also how you would adapt it to different kinds of games. Let's dive right into the first part, an introduction into the field of player guidance, what it is, why it matters, and how to approach it. Just take a quick look at this screenshot from Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. And think about it for a couple of seconds. Where do you think you have to go in this screenshot? I think that most of you would intuitively pursue that tower in the upper right part of the image, right here. And if we take a closer look at the environment, we can already see a rough path leading there. The reason why most of you identified the tower as a goal, even though it's quite small and in the distance of this picture, and why you already got an idea of the path leading there, is that Naughty Dog, the developers of Uncharted, are real experts in the field of player guidance. Now let's compare this screenshot to another game. Here again, just take another few seconds to think about where you intuitively think you have to go. Now I'm sure that most of you don't have a clear idea this time. Maybe we have to go further ahead. There's certainly some kind of path indicated on the ground, and it looks like some of the rocks are pointing in this direction. But just from the image, it's not really clear why you even have to go there. It's not clear whether there's a different path over there or whether it's just a dead end. On the other hand, we could also take this path on the left of the screen, but it kind of looks like it's leading us back to where we came from, so no obvious reason to pursue it either. Then there's some kind of hidden path that's leading to the right, back behind this massive statue. Again, this might be the path that the designers want us to take, but as I already mentioned, it's kind of hidden and it's not clearly emphasized. And finally, we could take this fourth option, leading us to the right as well, but this time in front of the statue. And some of those rocks on the ground certainly lead in this direction, but again, it's not clear why we should prioritize this path over any of the three other options that we just pointed out. So I hope this example makes clear that there's a huge difference between good guidance and bad player guidance when it comes to intuitively making clear where the player has to go and how they could get there. I think the best way to conceptualize player guidance is as another lens through which you can view and understand level design, and there are a couple of other lenses that you might be familiar with already. For example, you could use the play space to introduce the player to new mechanics and then challenge the player on those mechanics later, and I think most of the Nintendo games are pretty famous for that. You can also use space as an opportunity for storytelling, giving more information about the game world, its inhabitant, or trying to evoke a certain sense of atmosphere. More on the gameplay side of things, you can view your levels as a sequence of challenges that are constantly increasing in difficulty. Just like these three examples, player guidance is another lens that you could apply to level design, and in most larger projects you will have to work with multiple of these lenses at the same time. But depending on the kind of game you're developing, one or more of these lenses could take center stage. And if we talk about the lens of player guidance specifically, it's all about ease of navigation. So the goal of player guidance is to make the player understand the environment that they're in and then giving them the chance to traverse the play space intuitively. And if we want to achieve this intuitive navigation, we as level designers constantly have to take into account the human limitations that come up when we traverse an unfamiliar environment. For a slightly different perspective, game designer Jonathan Wilson writes in a Gamasutra article, "Good player navigation should never take control away from the player. Levels should be intuitively designed so that players understand what they have to do and how they can achieve it using the mechanics they have available." Now, to design your levels so that players intuitively know what to do and roughly how to achieve it, there are a couple of tools that you can use. Of course, a key tool is the actual layout of the level, and that is also what you as level designers are mainly responsible of. But also you can work together with your artist to leave visual cues in the environment, like this burning tree in Dark Souls here that definitely grabs the player's attention and leads them to inspect this tree. And you can also go much deeper into the actual gameplay side of things, like deciding where you place the enemies has a huge impact on where the player will go in your game world. I think from these examples you can already see that there are a couple of disciplines that contribute to achieving high quality player guidance, but the two main ones are definitely level design and environment art. So there will be a constant back and forth between you, the level designer, and your environment art team to ensure that the players understand the environment and intuitively traverse the play space. The reason why I think that player guidance is so important right now is that it perfectly lines up with two ongoing trends in the video game industry. And the first obvious trend is that our game worlds, just like the medium itself, have constantly evolved. And whereas game worlds were mostly 2D and would fit on one screen in the early days of video games, nowadays they can be huge open worlds which can be explored at the player's own will. And with this increase of the size and complexity of game worlds, it becomes even more important that our players don't get stuck or lost somewhere and always have a rough idea where to go. The other key trend is that we as game developers are right now striving for more accessibility of our games. So we want to make our work available for people of different age groups, different backgrounds, and even people with certain disabilities that would usually prevent them from engaging with the medium. And it's obvious that the less experience certain types of players have with games, the more important it is to provide them with a bit of direction in the game itself. The difference between good and bad player guidance is usually referred to as a difference between elegant and inelegant guidance. Elegant guidance usually means that you implement subtle techniques that guide the player without them really noticing it, so they're just intuitively making the right choices on where to go. And this achieves a lot of things for you. First of all, it reduces the frustration that comes up when you no longer know where to go in a level, and that certainly also reduces quitting. Elegant guidance also seamlessly blends into the game world and so keeps the player immersed in it. And lastly, when navigation is intuitive, it also frees up mental resources. So your player now has resources that could be spent on, for example, more challenging gameplay or a more complex story. On the other hand, if you screw up your guidance and it becomes inelegant, for example by just bombarding the player with dozens of HUD markers on where to go, this can have a lot of negative effects. For example, it can derail the player's attention away from the actual game world and onto something like just the interface, which is not that interesting usually. And in doing so, it often breaks the immersion of the player. And finally, when players really notice that they're being led by the designers, it damages the sense of autonomy and competence that usually comes up during play. So the player no longer feels like an active agent in this game world, making the choices themselves, and this is often referred to as hand-holding. Now with this comparison, I think it's obvious why you should aim for high quality, elegant guidance, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that player guidance is limited in some way. This limit lies in its focus on usability. So just because you're working to make your play space easy to navigate does not mean that it will eventually be fun to navigate because of that. So if you think about engaging level design, being able to actually traverse the play space is more of a prerequisite rather than a defining factor of this engaging experience. And usually other factors like the flow of the level, its aesthetic, the difficulty, or the storytelling will be much more memorable. And when you ask players about their favorite levels, they will rarely say, I really liked the levels in, for example, Uncharted just because I didn't get lost. You can compare this situation to having to go to an airport. If you get lost at the airport and perhaps even miss your flight, you certainly won't enjoy this experience. But just because you didn't get lost at an airport doesn't necessarily mean you will enjoy your stay or remember this airport for the rest of your life. You just take for granted that you don't get lost at a place that is designed for navigation. To get started with the player guidance in your own levels, it's very useful to break down your levels into 3 different kinds of paths. So when you have your level layout, you have a starting position for your player, and you have defined the goal of the level. First of all, there's the critical path. So this includes all the areas that your players have to visit in order to complete the level and progress in the game. And usually a large part of your budget is spent on the critical path because you're actually sure that all players will see these areas. On the other hand, we have all the optional paths, which are areas that your players may or may not visit based on their choosing. These areas could be opportunities for you to deliver more information about the game world, about the characters, or to reward the player for exploring a hidden area. But usually these are not directly linked to the game progression. And finally, there's the concept of the golden path, and you can think of that as the path that delivers the optimal experience for an average player of your target audience. When you release a game, there will be different kinds of players. Some of them will just visit the critical path and take the most direct route to the goal, maybe because they're journalists and have a deadline for finishing your game and writing about it. And then you also have completionists, so players that will want to see everything that's into your game. They will explore all of the optional paths that you have provided for them. Now, your average player usually is somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, and for them, the golden path is exactly what you want them to see. Just by definition, your golden path already includes the critical path and then also a selection of optional paths that you think add value for the average player. And when you have defined the golden path, it can serve as a foundation for your player guidance, so you can then implement certain means in your level design that guide the player along this golden path towards the goal. Alright, that's it for the introduction on what player guidance is, why you should care about it, and how to start approaching it. And we'll now talk about specific guiding techniques that you can apply to achieve high quality player guidance in your own levels. Before I give you some examples on what other games do in terms of player guidance, it can be useful to think about what you already know about the topic. So just imagine that you've been handed a game level and you're now tasked with improving the player guidance in this level. Think about what you can do to make sure that the player reaches the goal. Which techniques can you apply, how can you change the level, and what elements can you add onto it so that the player follows the golden path. You can just pause the video here and take 2 or 3 minutes to write down your answers before we continue. Alright, I hope you came up with some interesting ideas. When I taught this session to third semester students at my own university, we came up with a very long list of different elements that you can use, and I just want to highlight a couple of examples here. So one way to make sure that all players reach the goal is to simply provide different options. So you would have multiple paths that the player may or may not take, and all of them would lead to the same goal. And that drastically increases the chance that the player will discover at least one of these options and then follow it through. You can also play around with the in-game camera and adjust it so that it always rotates to capture the current goal of the level in its center. Sometimes player guidance can be just like in real life, and you can just put a sign somewhere that says going right here leads to this place and going left leads to another place. And this can be very effective as well, specifically because we're already familiar with signs for orientation in the real world. Or if you don't want to work with assets in the game world, you can certainly use the user interface and have quest logs that describe the current goal, or even markers that pop up somewhere and tell you where the goal is located and how far away you are right now. Okay, these were just a couple of interesting examples from our brainstorming. If you had other unique ideas that you would like to share, please just post them in the comments of this video. And we'll now move on to what I think are the most practically useful guiding techniques that popular games use all the time. First of all, there are landmarks. So a landmark is some kind of unique feature in your environment that can be recognized from a high distance. This means that it's often large structures or monuments, so it could be a bridge, a tower, or a huge corporate building in your game world. And in the level design community, they will sometimes be referred to as weenies. And I would encourage you to look up the origin story of that name. It's actually quite interesting, and despite the name, it's safe for work, I promise. When you have a landmark, it basically serves two functions at once. Either it can be a goal, so because these are very large structures, they act as visual magnets. Our eyes are immediately drawn to them and we want to go there and examine them up close. But they can also be used for orientation, so they can be points of reference in your game world, so you always know where you are right now in relation to this specific landmark. Looking at a couple of examples, both in real life and in games, the most popular example of a weenie or landmark is probably the castle in Disneyland. So you might know that this castle is visible right from the entrance. When visitors come in, they are immediately drawn to this castle, but also then later when they spread out and explore the different areas, they can always see the castle, and it acts as a familiar point of reference, so you always know where you are in relationship to the castle. In games, we can often see them used as short-term goals, such as in Life is Strange, where you have to move to the lighthouse of Arcadia Bay a couple of times actually, in a dream sequence, but also later in just a normal scenario. In Journey there is the mountain, which is actually the long-term goal of this game. This is where you have to get to finish the game, and it's also visible right from the start and always reminds you where you actually have to go right now. And in the lower right, there's the example of the new Zelda game, Breath of the Wild, which has an open world structure, and because of that you have landmarks everywhere, and the question is just which landmark do you want to pursue next. Thinking about landmarks, the advantages of those are that they become central elements of your game world. So it's not just some random UI element added on top, but these are actually fully integrated into your game world and add a sense of authenticity, because in real life there are landmarks everywhere, and it just makes sense to also see them in a game world. They serve this dual function of both providing the player with a direction on where to go, but also as a means of orientation, so knowing where you are right now, which is sometimes exactly what you want to give to the player. And when you do it properly, you can very well use these landmarks to convey a sense of progress. So just think about a game level where you start seeing a landmark very small in the distance, and then traversing this level, every now and then you get a different view on this landmark, and every time it's a slightly different angle, and you can see that it's getting bigger because you're approaching it. And this does a very good job at visualizing this sense of coming closer and the sense of progress for the player. If you use landmarks as goals, they are quite flexible, as in you can use them as short-term goals, long-term goals, or something in the middle. That's something we've already seen when you compare the lighthouse in Life is Strange as a short-term goal with the mountain in Journey. And also, if you take the first 2 points together, that they become central parts of your game world and that they can be used to provide both direction and orientation, it's no surprise why landmarks are used all the time for open world games. They just perfectly fit this more open structure. On the negative side, landmarks are often significant structures with unique silhouettes, so it's very costly to build them, especially on the art side of things. And that also means that you can't add landmarks late in development. You really have to consider them up front, and potentially even right at the start of your development, you will have to make a list of the landmarks you want to have. Also, since those landmarks are so central to the game world, it usually means that you have to organize your levels around them. Just think back to the example we had before with a level that gives you different perspectives on the same landmark, always coming closer. If you put yourself in that scenario, it's very clear that in the design process, you have to know the landmark up front and then organize the whole level around it to provide for those different views on it. And in that sense, the landmark restricts you in your level design process. And finally, something to think about is that every time you're showing a landmark to the player and they want to go there, you're also indirectly creating a sort of promise that you have to deliver on. So when you're teasing the player with a giant temple somewhere in the distance, and then they go there, it would be a real disappointment for the player if there's just a locked door and they can't actually enter the temple. So if you really want to fulfill the promise that you've set up, players should be able to go inside the temple and even find something very interesting there. And that means that potentially you will also have to build the interior of the temple, making it even more costly to set up this landmark. Next up, we have breadcrumbs. So this means you just place multiple smaller objects to form some kind of trail or path that the player then follows. The name of this technique comes from a German fairy tale called Hansel and Gretel, and in this fairy tale there are two kids that lay out a trail of breadcrumbs so they don't get lost in the woods and always find a way to return home. And this comes very close to the function that breadcrumbs can also fulfill in level design. Oftentimes, games use interactive elements that the player wants to obtain as breadcrumbs, so this could be pickups, collectibles, or even ammunition in a shooter game. But of course, you don't have to go that far into the gameplay side of things. It can also be purely environmental, like a trail of rocks leading you somewhere. As for some examples, the Mario series is famous for using coins as breadcrumbs. So the coins that you can actually pick up are used to indicate certain paths where you have to go, or even point you to certain secrets in the game world. In The Witcher 3, when you activate your Witcher senses, you can sometimes see footprints or other clues related to your current quest highlighted in red, and they will act as breadcrumbs leading you to the next part of this quest. And this image in the lower part is an example of purely environmental breadcrumbs, where these little rocks are used to indicate the paths that you can take in this game. On the positive side, since you're just repeatedly placing the same object, it's very cheap and quick to implement breadcrumbs. And unlike landmarks that we talked about before, breadcrumbs are usually used to define a path instead of a goal, and sometimes the path is just what you want to indicate to the player. Also, breadcrumbs can be incredibly effective, and especially if you do it with gameplay objects that have some kind of meaning for the player, like pickups. On the negative side, breadcrumbs can be quite direct, so it's not that subtle when you follow a trail of coins that leads you somewhere in the Mario games. And when done with gameplay elements, it can even inflate your in-game resources. So just think about Mario again, where you have these coins placed everywhere to guide the player, and that means that the world is obviously full of coins and a single coin isn't worth much anymore. Because breadcrumbs are cheap and quick to implement, you can add them late in development to hide bad design. So when you have a fundamental problem with the player guidance in your level, breadcrumbs usually do the trick of covering up the problem. But of course, it's more of a workaround and the fundamental problem still exists. And lastly, if you don't do it correctly, breadcrumbs can really break the immersion. So think about a situation in a game where you stumble upon a location that has never been discovered by anybody else before. But then you notice that you were led there by a trail of coins or ammunition, and there's just no reason why coins or ammunition should even be there. So you have to think carefully what type of elements you use as breadcrumbs so as not to break the player's immersion. Another very useful technique is leading lines and pinching. When an environment forms or includes lines that guide the viewer's eye towards the main subject, it's referred to as leading lines. And these can come in two forms. They can either be convergent or continuous. If you have convergent leading lines, there are multiple lines coming from different directions, but they all point towards the same center of interest. Like here in this example, we have all the different lines coming from the lower part, but also from the upper part, leading to this rectangular exit of the bridge. The other type of leading lines are continuous, so that means that you have leading lines that lead into other leading lines and then lead into more leading lines, and so they form a path that guides the eye along it. In this example from Mirror's Edge, we first have leading lines guiding the eye forward, these lines on the ground as well as this little box container. Then there are these wooden planks leading the eye up and to the right. Then we finally have some straight horizontal lines from the pipe and these other wooden planks that just lead the eye to the right. So thinking about it in a sequence, your eye is guided forward, then upward and to the right. And then there's a related technique called pinching, where you take individual objects in your scene and rotate them in a way that they funnel the player to a specific location. In games, this is often done with cars or crates. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. In the upper left, there's leading lines in traditional photography. In the upper right, there's a screenshot from The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, where we have the railway tracks, the electricity cables, and some of the branches all guiding our eye towards this illuminated center of the composition. In The Last of Us Part 2, this is a clear example of pinching, where all these different trucks and cars are rotated to funnel the player towards the goal of this level. And just in the lower right, it's the same thing done with crates. The advantages of leading lines are that this is a very subtle and elegant technique, and your players usually won't notice it. The only way to really notice the influence of leading lines is to take a screenshot and then paint in the lines, and only then you can really tell where the composition directs your eye. Also, in the case of pinching, where you just rotate the object, this doesn't even require you to create any new objects. It just requires you to rotate them in a specific way. And because of that, you can create leading lines and apply pinching even late in development. The disadvantage is that the reason why leading lines are so prominent in photography is that they rely on a fixed perspective. And in a lot of games, we don't have a fixed perspective. So you really have to be careful that leading lines that work from one camera angle don't suddenly screw up your entire scene when they're viewed from a slightly different angle. Also, the downside of being subtle and elegant is that sometimes leading lines are way too subtle to be effective. And if you think back about the two examples of convergent and continuous leading lines, you saw that the whole scene basically was full of different leading lines, and you sometimes need a lot of them to make an impact. And the problem is that generally just when you create a scene, naturally a lot of lines will emerge, and not all of them can be planned by you. So there will be a lot of unintended leading lines that you have to pay attention to when setting up a scene. A very interesting concept from design in general is the concept of affordance. And this is the quality of an object to communicate how it's supposed to be used, just via its physical properties, the way it looks, the way it feels, and so on. This is often associated with the saying that form follows or implies function, and you're probably familiar with a lot of affordances from real life. The handle of a door affords grabbing and pulling, whereas the handle of a teacup affords grabbing and picking up. Ladders naturally afford climbing because of the way they're constructed, and there are many other examples of affordances. They're almost everywhere. Affordances also come in different forms. First of all, there are the common affordances, sometimes called positive affordances, where an object looks like you can do something with it, and then when you try it, it actually works. Then there are negative or denying affordances. So that means an object tells you that it can't be used in a certain way, and then when you try it, it also doesn't work. In the example on the lower half here, we have the rubble blocking the entrance to this house, which is a clear denying affordance that you can't go there. And then lastly, we have false affordances. So this would be an object that tells you that a certain type of interaction is possible, but then when you try it, it actually doesn't work. And I think all of you are familiar with at least one door in real life where you constantly try to pull, then it doesn't work, you notice and have to push instead. And this is a clear example of a false affordance. False affordances naturally create frustration because we try something and then notice that it doesn't work. So it's something that you should look out for and avoid in game design in general. Affordances are used in games everywhere. If you have a look at the example in the top left, it's a new Tomb Raider game where you have these wooden ramps that are half suspended in the air and they always afford jumping off. In God of War, certain edges of the rocks are shaped to afford climbing, and we even have these Nordic runes indicating that something is possible there. In the lower left, there's Jedi Fallen Order, where the walls where you can perform wall running always have a very distinct shape. It's almost unnatural. It looks just like a floor that has been rotated by 90 degrees, but it does a great job at communicating that you can run on these walls. And in the lower right, there's an example of a denying affordance in The Last of Us, where a path that you're not supposed to take is not just indicated by a shut door, but by all of these drawers lying around and barricading the path. The positive thing about affordances is that they prompt interaction. They don't just tell you where to go, but they immediately tell you how to interact with a certain object. And that is very useful for an interactive medium like games. A lot of affordances work because they connect to our real life knowledge. We know that ladders in real life are used to climb up, so when we see a ladder in a video game, we will try the same thing. And when you're consistent with your affordances, you're building a rule set that the player can follow. Like the example of the Tomb Raider game where a wooden ramp always means you can jump off. And if you're consistent with that rule set and communicate it properly to the player, this can build a trust contract between the designer and the player. The downside of an affordance is that whether we understand an affordance and how we understand it, it very much depends on the context. For example, a calm river might afford swimming through, but if your character is designed in a way that the player thinks they're not able to swim, then players also wouldn't get the affordance. And you have to be careful to not create affordances that are only understandable for people from a certain culture. Because as we've identified before, these affordances often connect to what we know from real life. And if you're working with objects that afford something in your culture but not in other cultures, they might not work in a game for an international market. Also, it's very easy to create false affordances, like rocks that look like you could climb there, but then you actually can't. So you have to look out for them and try to remove them as well as you can. And of course, your affordances somehow have to make sense in your game world. For example, if your player is discovering a location in your game world where human beings have never been, it of course wouldn't make sense if there's a ladder lying around or something. Next up in the list are shapes. And shapes are a very universal tool that can be used in different ways. First of all, it's important to know that we have emotional associations with primitive shapes, so with pointy shapes, round shapes, and rectangular shapes. And it's quite interesting and useful to know that these associations are actually consistent across different cultures. Taking a closer look at these associations, round shapes are usually seen as unthreatening, as safe and inviting. Then we have rectangular shapes that are kind of neutral but also seen as stable and useful. And I would suspect that is because of a mental connection between rectangular shapes and buildings in our mind. And lastly, there are triangular or diagonal shapes that are uninviting, aggressive, and dangerous. And that makes sense because many things that can hurt us in real life actually have pointy shapes. You can also use shapes to create contrast. So a shape that is very much unlike the shapes that surround it naturally draws attention to it. Just like with affordances, you can use shapes to create a rule set in your game world. For example, you can say that all the round doors can be opened by the players, but for all the rectangular doors you first have to find some sort of key. And the shapes that you use in the layout of your space already imply how it's supposed to be traversed, and that is something that architects study a lot. For example, when you have a rectangular shape, especially if it's narrow, your only two options are to go ahead or to go back. So when you have a rectangular room or a hallway, it naturally makes us move through quite quickly. The opposite of that is a circular shape. So circular rooms make us wander around, and that is why you see that a lot of exhibitions are actually held in circular rooms, so that the visitors spend some time walking around and inspecting all the different exponents. And then we have triangular structures, usually not in the actual layout of the space, but in real life. In 3D, there are many triangular structures like mountains or pyramids, and they either make us reach the top or we have to circumvent them entirely. A few examples of the use of shapes in games. In The Legend of Zelda, we can see the emotional associations playing a role. So the platform that you're supposed to walk on is rectangular and stable, and all the things that you have to avoid in this scene are triangular, so these spikes here. In God of War, there's a nice use of shape contrast. You might remember that you're starting out in some kind of forest. So, of course, a forest, because of the tree, has a lot of vertical shapes. But the chests, where you can find loot, have a very boxy, more horizontal shape. So they naturally stand out in this environment. Uncharted is a very nice example of using shapes to create a rule set, where these thin horizontal shapes that almost look like slits always tell you that this is a place where you can climb. And in Assassin's Creed Origins, there's the use of shapes to imply movement with all the different pyramids. So these are triangular structures. We either want to reach the top or circumvent them. And in Assassin's Creed, it's actually possible to reach the top because of the climbing system. And either way, it makes for a very nice moment. Either you reach the top and then you get a nice overview of the environment, or you have to go around them. And that makes for a nice reveal of an area, because pyramids are obviously quite huge at the bottom part, so they block a lot of your view. And when you circumvent them, it then reveals a lot of areas that before you were not able to see. The upsides of shapes are that, first of all, they're a more or less direct connection to the subconsciousness of your players, and the interpretations of shapes are quite clear and consistent across cultures. So a triangular shape will be seen as uninviting no matter whether your game is played in the United States or somewhere in Africa. And also you can apply shapes at multiple levels, so it could be the overall layout of your space, it could be the shape of individual objects, but you can go even lower than that and include certain kinds of shape in the textures of individual objects. However, on the negative side, the main responsibility for creating shapes obviously belongs to the artists on a project. So you will have to communicate a lot with the artists if you want to influence how shapes are used in your game, and your artists actually might not like that. And just with leading lines, shapes are basically everywhere, and when you put together a scene, you can't control all of the shapes that will emerge there eventually. Now, moving on to the last technique, there is color. And just like shapes, color is a very universal and flexible tool. For example, you can use the contrast of different colors to highlight something and draw the attention of the player to a certain element. In the example here, you can see the pink light of this shop building that clearly stands out in the darker monochromatic scene. Also, we have emotional associations with different colors. Just think about red, the color of blood, and fire that is usually used to communicate danger. And you can use these associations to guide the player and also for shadow. So if you think about a path that splits up into two different paths, where from one path you can see very cold light blue lighting, and from the other one it's more of an orange warm lighting, you can actually give the player an idea of where these paths might lead just through the use of color. And finally, in games we often use color coding, so that means that we establish some sort of connection between the use of colors and certain game rules. So you could say that in your game all the blue doors can be opened, whereas all the red doors are locked, for example. In the upper left we have a really nice example of color contrast. So this green lighting in the hallway really stands out because it contrasts the rest of the scene that is more purplish, bluish. In Super Mario Odyssey, there's a nice use of the emotional associations with colors. So the areas where Mario can just safely go are in this light brown pastel color, whereas the things that Mario has to avoid are, first of all, the lava here that has a very unnatural, highly saturated pink, and then also the fire enemies that have this orange and red color. So it's very clear here what you have to avoid and where you can go. South Park, The Stick of Truth, is a really nice example of color coding, where all the loot containers that you can actually open have orange handles, and all the things that you can't open just have black handles. And in the lower right we have Mirror's Edge, and this game has a feature called Runner's Vision, where all of the elements that are part of the critical path, so where the player has to go, are actually highlighted in red and really stand out in the scene. The good thing about color is that, unlike some of the other techniques that we've discussed so far, they can be effectively used for foreshadowing because of all of those rich associations that we have with colors. And in the same way that shapes and affordances can be used to build up a rule set, color can do the exact same thing. And if you're consistent with your use of colors and what they mean, you're really building up this trust contract between the player and the level designer. The downside of using color is that an overuse of color, and especially of color contrast, can make your scene quite noisy and unappealing, and that is also why the main responsibility for choosing colors usually belongs to the artist. And again, if you want to influence it, it means you will have to engage in a lot of communication with your art department. And one thing that we have to consider is that there are different types of color blindness, and color blindness is actually quite prevalent in the population. So it's usually not a good idea to rely on color exclusively to communicate something. Alright, that's it for the specific techniques that I wanted to present to you. Of course, there are many more, but I think these 6 are actually the most useful and practically applicable ones. Now let's talk about an assignment that you could work on in case you want to practice implementing different guiding means. If you're not interested in this assignment and just want to continue with the rest of the lecture, please just skip to the next chapter of this video and we'll continue there. So for those who are interested, you can complete this assignment on your own, and it takes roughly between 50 and 60 minutes. And you can break it down into 3 steps actually. So the first step would be to just sketch out digitally or on paper the layout for a game level, just like you can see on the right here. You can totally decide what genre the game is, the mechanics that are available in this level, and also the goal, so where you have to go in this level. It's completely up to you to decide, but don't spend too much time on it. This is really about focusing on player guidance. In the second step, we then come back to the concept that we discussed before: critical path, optional path, and the golden path. Think about the areas in your level that all players have to visit, then the areas that your players may or may not visit, and then define the golden path. So where do you want your average player to go? What do you want them to see? And with those defined, also try to visualize them somehow in your layout. And in the final step, then you should implement specific guiding techniques like the ones we discussed, or whatever else you came up with during the brainstorming, to lead the player along that golden path that you define, and also try to visualize the techniques somehow. To make this task a bit more unique for you specifically, you will receive a level theme and a guidance constraint. So the level theme is just the rough location that your level should represent, like for example a haunted manor, and this should just help you kickstart the creative process. And then the guidance constraint is a certain type of condition that you should pay attention to when you decide what kind of techniques to apply. So for example, this one is called the power of sound, and says that a lot of people live with serious vision impairments, so try to make sure that your level can be completed by a blind player. And this is actually quite a difficult constraint, so the actual constraints are much easier than that. If you want to complete this assignment and work with one of the themes that I have prepared, just think about a number between 1 and 7. You have one? Alright, then let's reveal them. So 1 would be a tropical forest, 2 is a corporate building, then there's a coastal town, 4 is a cave system, and we've got an ancient temple, national park is number 6, and finally, an abandoned factory is number 7. Now for the guidance constraints. Also here, pick a number between 1 and 7. And then let's take a look at them. So 1 is studio layoffs. Half of your art team has been laid off. Keep the additional requirements for the art team to a minimum. So this is all about reducing the amount of work that your approach to guidance creates for the other disciplines on your project. Number 2, deliberate confusion. Design a section of your level to make the player get lost for a short time. Make sure they rediscover the path eventually. Of course, you can also use techniques of player guidance to achieve the exact opposite, to make the player get lost or stuck somewhere. And this constraint is exactly about that. The third constraint is nothing to see here. The last game of your studio has been criticized for excessive hand-holding. Make sure the players won't notice your player guidance this time. So try to be subtle. Number 4, minimalism. The art director reminded you of the minimalistic approach of this project. Try to use as few different elements as possible. This is all about figuring out which elements have the most impact just by themselves. Number 5, the visible hand. So this time around you want the player to feel like they're not in control. So make sure that your guidance will be noticed by the player. It could be that you're working on a game where the story is all about the player thinking that they're being controlled by somebody else, for example. And in this case, it could make sense to be very obvious with your guidance and make sure that the player notices that to make some kind of point for your story. Number 6, accessibility upgrade. This time you're going for the mass market. Make sure your level can be played by people with various disabilities or impairments. So here it's important to think about certain barriers that people usually face when they're confronted with game levels and how you could tackle them. And finally, number 7, backtracking. Players will return to your level later in the game. Your player guidance should lead them to the goal of your level and back to the start, and you should use the same elements for that. Alright, now that you've got a theme and a guidance constraint, you can start working on the assignment. I would recommend spending no more than 50 or 60 minutes on this assignment, so just pause the video here and we'll continue when you're done. For the final part of the session, we'll go back to theory a bit and think about different ways how we could categorize guiding means, and then we'll see how player guidance could be adapted to specific kinds of games, such as open world games or multiplayer games. First of all, we should acknowledge that player guidance can be used to serve a variety of functions, and probably the classical one is to provide the player with goals and a rough direction on how to get there. If you completed the assignment, this is exactly what you did there by specifying the golden path and then leading the player along that path. Another important function is to improve the readability of your game space and the environment. So you want to make sure that the way the players perceive the environment is just like you intended them to see it. And I think the issue of bad readability becomes much clearer with an example. Just take a look at this screenshot. Do you think this is a corridor that leads somewhere, or is it just a dead end? I think if you really examine this closely, you could see that this corridor actually leads to the right at the end. But this is an example of bad readability. A player who just looks at this for a second might think this is a corridor, I have to go there, and then might be disappointed if it turns out to be a dead end. Or they might think it's a dead end and don't even bother exploring it, but it actually is a corridor that leads you somewhere else. Maybe perhaps it's actually the corridor where you have to go. And if the player never discovers that, then they'll just get stuck. So corridor without guiding elements results in very bad readability in this case. But if you compare this actual game, we can see that they did a lot to improve the readability here. We have light coming from the right side and actually some particles, so it clearly indicates that there's something else there and we should go there. And we also have these continuous elements, so we have pipes going around here but ending here, so the pipes on the left don't continue. And then here at the back wall we have a pipe just starting here and going to the right, and it doesn't seem to end. So this clearly indicates that this corridor goes on and is in fact not a dead end. When you want to achieve good readability, this sometimes means that you have to implement additional guiding elements, and you can't just leave the space the way you constructed it. Another function of player guidance can be to facilitate the orientation within the game world. So this is not the player asking where do I have to go, but more about where am I right now. And usually this is in relationship to already familiar parts in the game. We already talked about how landmarks can facilitate a player's sense of where they are because it serves as a familiar point of reference. Then another function is to present the player with the options they have, so the paths that they can take, and also contextualize them in some way so the player knows what each of these options would mean. Let's look at a bad example of providing options. The classical T-junction is actually a player guidance disaster, basically. If you look at this image, it's clear that you have a choice. At the end of this corridor, you can either go to the left or to the right. So we clearly presented the options, but they're lacking context. It's not clear what left in this case means, where left would lead or where right would lead. And this is a bit of a problem because of two reasons. First of all, for you as a designer, it's basically a coin flip whether the player goes to the left or to the right here. And that means that you have to make sure that each of these paths are actually equally valid. So you can't prioritize one path over the other. And if you can't prioritize, that's actually quite bad for your overall production. But from the player's perspective, this is actually also quite bad because the player doesn't have enough information to make an informed decision here. The path to the left looks exactly like the path to the right. The player might actually really flip a coin to decide which path to take here. And this is quite the opposite of a meaningful choice. So fixing this problem usually means one of two things. Either you emphasize one path through means of player guidance, like here going to the right is clearly emphasized, and the player would probably then identify that as the main path. If they just want to follow the main path, they will go to the right. And if they're completionists, they will see that this level guides you to the right and will actually just deliberately go to the left to see if there's something there. But what already improved is that the player has information here to make a decision. And we as designers could prioritize here and optimize the path going to the right. Or you can clearly contextualize both options. So if you look at this screenshot, this is actually more or less a T-junction. You can either go through that door there, or you can take these wooden planks to the left. But these options actually mean different things. So going through the door looks like the classical approach here. It looks like a safe option. Whereas going to the left, it looks quite dangerous. It's a very narrow path and it actually looks like you would fall off. So because it looks more dangerous, it's more of the unconventional approach here. But the player might expect to find something rewarding their courage. However, these options could also mean something else. If this is a shooter where the player has learned that there are enemies lurking behind doors, they would maybe take the path to the left, go around this building, enter it from a different location, and could then shoot the enemy from behind. So then going to the left here would actually be the safer option, even though it would take a little bit more time. But either way, the player has enough information here to clearly distinguish the two options and then make an informed decision on which path to pursue. And as the last function of player guidance, you can certainly use it to highlight different elements that are important in your scene, which can often be done through contrast in terms of color or shape. So for example, if you have a puzzle game in a 3D environment, you could use player guidance to clearly highlight which elements of this game space are part of the puzzle. So the player doesn't waste time trying to figure out what is part of the puzzle, but can actually dedicate their mental resources to figuring out how to put everything together. So to sum up, providing goals and direction, improving readability, facilitating orientation, presenting and contextualizing options, and highlighting important elements would be different functions or purposes that your guidance might fulfill. And depending on the type of game you're developing, one or multiple of these would be very important and other ones could be neglected. Apart from the purpose of guidance, we can also categorize different guiding elements. And one distinction that we can draw here is a distinction between push and pull. So in a level we have elements that repulse the player, that push them away, and other elements that attract the player and that pull the player towards them. For example, on the push side we could think of dark areas that you might not want to go to, hard boundaries, so generally where you just can't go in the level, way too difficult enemies. We already talked about triangular shapes and cold colors that can play a role with their emotional associations. And then on the pull side, it's more or less the opposite. We can have well-lit areas that attract, landmarks obviously, round shapes and inviting colors, or we could use techniques like breadcrumbs, so a trail of collectibles to pull the player towards it. Here it's very important to note that these are no fixed categories, so you can't say that a specific technique like round shapes always falls into the pull category. Whether an element attracts or repels, so whether it's part of push or pull, it really depends on the genre of the game you're developing. For example, in an action adventure, you would usually be drawn to the light and investigate well-lit places. Whereas when you're playing a stealth game, suddenly you want to avoid all of these well-lit areas, and all of a sudden dark areas become attracting and lit areas become repelling. Apart from depending on the genre, whether an element attracts or repels can also change during gameplay. Think of an RPG, for example, where in the beginning you're faced with enemies that are of a too high level, that are too difficult to beat. So they would naturally push the player away at the start. But then later, when you level up and become strong enough to defeat them, they might actually attract the player because they promise interesting loot, or because defeating them might lead you to a secret area in the game world. We can also think of the categories of direct and indirect guidance. So direct guidance consists of elements that the player consciously notices. For example, think of the graffiti in Counter-Strike that tells you whether you're approaching A, B, or C. And when the player consciously notices these elements, it can then inform cognitive processes like decision making. And on the other hand, we have indirect guidance, which is more or less the opposite. So these would be all the elements that subtly nudge the player without them really noticing. And this would include a lot of the things that we already talked about. But here in this example from BioShock Infinite, it's the great use of light and dark that guides the player in the scene. And this is usually something that players don't consciously notice. The difference between direct and indirect guidance is a very player-centric approach. Are these elements noticed by the player, and how do they determine their behavior, if at all? We can also categorize guiding means depending on how they fit into the game world. This would be the distinction between diegetic and non-diegetic. You would label as diegetic all the elements that are natural within the game world, that you expect to be there, that make sense in a way in the game world. And on the other hand, non-diegetic are all those artificial elements that you superimpose on the game world. For example, a minimap is an artificial element because it's a system that just makes sense in a game, but not in the actual world that you're traversing. On the diegetic side, there's a lot of what we already talked about. You can use landmarks, you can use ambient sound, for example the sound of a waterfall might attract a player. There can be actual paths and roads indicated in the game world. We can include signs or use friendly NPCs and enemies to guide the player. On the non-diegetic side, we have stuff like minimaps on the UI, radars, HUD markers, or special visions like the runner's vision of Mirror's Edge that I already showed you before. And if you look at these elements, you can already see that this goes much more into the design of systems than the actual level design. But still, they have a huge impact on player guidance, and you have to be aware of these non-diegetic elements and their effect on player guidance when you design your levels. The final categorization that I personally find very useful is one between static guidance, dynamic guidance, and requested guidance. Static guidance is mostly what we talked about before. So these are assets that you directly build into your level, like this statue acting as a landmark in BioShock Infinite. And being built into the level, these assets don't really change during the course of the game. Then there's dynamic guidance, which would be systems that are in some way context sensitive, like a minimap, because the image that this minimap is showing always depends on where you are in the game world. Of course, the advantage here is that you don't have to program a new minimap for every level, but once you've got the minimap working, it should work for all of the different levels that you're building. So elements of dynamic guidance are usually flexible enough so that once you've created them, they can be applied to different contexts in your game world. And the same is not true for static guidance, where adding a landmark in one level doesn't mean that you can suddenly get rid of the landmarks in other levels. And lastly, there's requested guidance, which I like to think of optional assistance that the player can activate when they need it. For example, this could be non-diegetic. It could be that you can just open your map, place a marker, and then the game leads you there somehow. But it could also be part of the game world itself, where maybe you could talk to an NPC and then they could give you more direct instructions to reach your current goal. With all of these different ways of thinking about the functions of player guidance and how to categorize it, let's apply what we've learned to a specific game. Let's talk about Ghost of Tsushima for a moment. So this is a AAA game that was released for PS4 in 2020, and it's basically a combination of an action adventure and a stealth game in an open world. The character that you're seeing here is the protagonist, Jin, who's a samurai, and he wants to liberate his home, Tsushima Island, from the Mongols that are currently invading it. As I've already mentioned, this game takes place in an open world. So a goal for the level designers here is to create an immersive open world that also rewards the player for exploring it. And this actually breaks down into a couple of problems or questions that the designers had to tackle. First off, how do you effectively guide the player without breaking the immersion of this game world? If you constantly bombard them with HUD markers or have them open the map, of course that takes them out of this game world, even if it's just for a couple of seconds. Also, a real problem of open worlds is that you as the designer can never anticipate where your player is right now and where they want to go. So your guidance has to be flexible enough so that it works from wherever the player is right now to wherever they want to go. In a large open world, it's really important that you make sure your player always has the next goal to pursue, because if the player no longer has an idea what to do in your game world, they will quickly quit the game and probably never return to it. And lastly, you have to figure out a way to make sure that the player discovers all of those special locations that you created in the game world and naturally stumbles upon them. The way Ghost of Tsushima tackled these problems is through a combination of different methods. First of all, there's the very classical approach. So almost all open world games rely on having a lot of different landmarks, and you can see some of them in this screenshot here, and then giving the players a lot of different opportunities to view all those different landmarks and pick the next one to go to. So there are a lot of elevated locations from which you can get a really nice overview of the game world. And this focus on landmarks and elevated locations, showcasing them, is used in many open world games from Skyrim to The Witcher to the new Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. But Ghost of Tsushima actually goes beyond that and has a couple of unique ideas that it added. First of all, there are the golden birds. So when you're walking around in this game world, sometimes you will just see a golden bird appearing and they will lead you to a special location. Could be an important NPC, could be a certain reward in the game world, but just by following them you will naturally discover an interesting location. Then there's a feature that Ghost of Tsushima became famous for, the guiding wind. So you can just open your map and put a marker on a certain location where you want to go, and then the wind in the game world, the wind gusts, will actually lead you there. and you can even press a dedicated button on the PS4 controller that will intensify the wind for a second, so it becomes very obvious where you actually have to go. And lastly, there are the fox dens. So these are special locations in the world, and if you come really close to that den, a fox will come out, and just by following it, it will naturally lead you to a hidden shrine, and that's a place where you can get a special reward in the game world. So to summarize the approach of the developers of Ghost of Tsushima, they focused on providing a lot of different landmarks and vistas to showcase them. And then there's a focus on diegetic dynamic guidance. So those golden birds are actually a system programmed into the game. The developers didn't place individual birds where they might appear. It just depends on the distance between the protagonist and an interesting location whether a bird will appear. And this is of course a diegetic element because these birds are actually part of Tsushima Island and you would just expect them to live there. And finally, we have a strong focus on diegetic requested guidance. So the wind is an example for that. The wind only comes up if you want to use it, but also the fox dens where you really have to come close so that the fox starts moving are elements of guidance that the player has to activate themselves. And of course both the wind and the fox are something that you would expect in this game world, so they don't really break the immersion. Okay, I hope you can see how this approach relates to the problems of open world games that we identified before. And now let's talk about adapting to a different kind of game, specifically multiplayer games. Before I keep on presenting, just imagine for a second that you have been tasked with designing levels for a competitive first-person shooter that is played in teams of 5. You can think of CSGO or the more recent Valorant by Riot Games. With this scenario in mind, what are some potential challenges and problems regarding player guidance that you will have to face eventually? And you can think of this specifically from the perspective of how do multiplayer games differ from single-player games and which requirements does that add for a level design. So just pause the video here for a couple of minutes and sort out your thoughts about challenges for player guidance in multiplayer games. Alright, before this session I already wrote down what I think are the most important challenges in a multiplayer game like this. So first of all, if we talk about a competitive first-person shooter, the teams have to make decisions in split seconds, so somehow our level design has to facilitate that quick decision making. Also, a main difference between single player and multiplayer games is that there's no defined goal, so the center of action in a multiplayer game continually shifts based on where fights emerge and where the different teams are going right now. So we as level designers don't have specific predetermined goals that we can guide the player towards. And lastly, a team-based game like this is often played in teams of friends that already know each other or people that are hanging out on the voice chat. So there will be a lot of communication, and certainly our level designs should also facilitate talking about the game in some way. So quick decision making, a continually shifting center of action, and the focus of communication are the main challenges that I see in multiplayer games for player guidance. Of course, identifying the problems is only the first step. We also have to solve them in some way. So with the challenges and problems in mind, both the ones that you came up with and the ones I presented, how are we going to tackle them? Try to think about the different functions of player guidance that we talked about, which ones are more important in multiplayer games and which ones can be neglected, but also consider the different categories of guiding means and which ones you think will be most effective and why. Again, try to pause the video and think about this for 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll continue. Okay, when I thought about this before the session and looked at different multiplayer games, what I found was that there's a focus on facilitating the orientation of the player and providing them with clear options. So these would be the primary functions that our player guidance has to fulfill in a multiplayer games. And giving the player a goal and direction becomes way less important because we don't know where they have to go at any given moment. Also, what a lot of multiplayer games do is that they have points of interest for the gameplay. You might know that in Valorant, one of the win conditions is to place a bomb at a specified location, and this can be placed in 3 different areas, A, B, or C. And once you've determined these different areas, they serve as points of interest for the gameplay. This has actually 2 advantages. First of all, it makes it easier for the player to build a mental map of your level when there are meaningful places, A, B, and C in this case for them. But also this tackles the problem of the shifting center of action. Now we know that there are at least 3 different places where players want to go eventually, and we can use guiding means to make clear which paths lead to A, B, or C. And then something that's also done quite frequently is called thematic chunking. So within the same map of a multiplayer level, you'll often find huge contrasts in the visuals or the theme of different parts of the level. Just like here in Valorant, you have the part of the level in the foreground that looks more like a modern factory, and then in the background we see old Chinese architecture. So there's a huge contrast between those two parts of the map, and that can actually be used to identify which part of the map belongs to one team, to the attackers, and which part belongs to the defenders. And just by giving this map two distinct themes, a player can always know if they're currently in their own area or in the area of their enemies. Also, a lot of multiplayer games provide direct guidance through diegetic signs. Think about the graffiti in CSGO that shows you where to go if you want to reach A, B, or C. This is direct guidance because we want the player to process this information and then use it for decision making, which, as we've discussed, is very important in multiplayer games. And it's obviously static and diegetic because this is an element within the level. It's not a system and the player doesn't have to activate it. And the graffiti at least somewhat makes sense in this area. But apart from this, we also have dynamic non-diegetic elements. You will rarely find a multiplayer game that doesn't have a minimap or a radar or actually a combination of both. And even though these are non-diegetic elements and obviously distract from the game world a bit, because they're dynamic and because they're always in the same position on the interface and they show simplified versions of the environment, they're really effective at helping with this decision making in split seconds. And the fact that they're non-diegetic isn't that important in games that are heavily focused on their gameplay, such as Valorant or CSGO. This actually concludes what I can offer on player guidance within the time frame of this session, but actually I've collected a list of recommended resources that you can check out if you want to learn more about specific parts of player guidance. The direct links to those resources and a download link for the slides will be in the video description, so make sure to check that out. And the first resource is a bachelor thesis called Exploring Level Design and Its Use of Visual Language. And this was written by Tristan, a student who finished his bachelor at the Cologne Game Lab at my university this year. And it's a great introduction into the topic of player guidance and a summary of the available literature. This is a very good resource to consider if you need a refresher on the basics of player guidance. If you've enjoyed the second part of this session where we talked about specific guiding techniques and you might want to know more about them to expand your toolset, there's a great GDC talk called Level Design Workshop, Block Mesh and Lighting Tips. And in the first half of this talk, David Schaefer, a level designer at Naughty Dog, talks about a whole list of different guiding principles that they use in Uncharted but also in The Last of Us. And a lot of those will sound familiar to you if you've listened to this presentation, but there are also a couple ones that I didn't touch on, like gates and valves and the use of light, for example. Perhaps you're still struggling with applying those techniques to your own levels, and maybe you found out about that by working on the assignment that I described. In that case, there's another great video talk for you called Level Design and Environment Art Tips and Techniques. And here, level designer Peter Field of Media Molecule walks the audience through a level that he built in Dreams, the game/game engine made by Media Molecule. And he really breaks down his thought process and talks a lot about the different guiding elements that he added. And you can see live comparisons of parts of the level without the guiding elements and then with them added in. In case you're more interested in diving a little bit deeper into the theory, there's a great series of online blogs called Push and Pull by a game designer called Clement Melendez. And in those 9 different blog entries, he goes really in depth about certain subtopics about player guidance, such as mental mapping or the composition of scenes. And I think this is really worth your time if you want to further your understanding of the whole theory of player guidance. And finally, there's another bachelor thesis that I want to recommend to you. Not from a CGL student this time, but from a student called Yuha. And she wrote about level flow and player guidance in a 3D multiplayer level, and actually worked on quite an interesting project where she built a custom map for Team Fortress 2 as her bachelor thesis, and this map actually ended up becoming one of the most popular maps in competitive play. And in her thesis, she talks about her thought process and with a special focus on the elements of player guidance that she added to this multiplayer level. And not only is this a great resource in general, but it ties into the last part of today's session where we talked about adapting player guidance to different means and takes it a little bit further in terms of multiplayer guidance. Alright, those are the resources that I found most useful. Remember, the links to access them are in the video description. And that's actually it for this session on player guidance. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions about the topic or if you want to leave feedback on this session, please let me know in the comments of this video. Thank you very much and bye bye.